whether they needed to respond back quickly, whether they needed to respond that way. I don't know the answer to that. I know they responded fast, and I know, well, in my view, there wasn't a great deal of forward planning. So if you look at the mess that there is now, you wonder whether a bit more strategising about what the implications of certain actions might be might have changed the course of events. I don't know. You need to ask military specialists about that. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know whether there was another alternative. I don't think it's practical to say they could have gone into Afghanistan with teachers and builders, and because they were attacked and they needed to respond, and the problem was that it wasn't a government that attacked them. So they went to the place where the people that attacked them hung out and attacked back. And that's why I think there was a problem. They didn't really deal with the people who attacked them thoroughly. They dealt with the people who they were hanging out with. And that's where we've got to now. In terms of withdrawal, when I say I think we need to withdraw, I mean, I think that's a sort of statement of the obvious. I don't think you'd find anybody in the Defence Force or anywhere who would say we should be staying there forever. But I do think we have to think about how we manage that withdrawal, because I do think you risk making things worse both for our forces and creating greater risk for our forces, but also for the people who live there and have to live there once we're gone. And you inject yourself so deeply into a community, as we've all done now, our governments, that you have to be careful when you pull that out, because you can destabilise the community and create power imbalances. And yeah, there's a I didn't go into this at the time, but there's a great there's controversy about who the Allied forces have chosen to associate with in terms of locally based power brokers. There's a bloke by the name of Matiullah Khan, who's a warlord basically in the south, who's been appointed by the president as the police chief in Uruzgan province. He runs a private militia of 2,400 men. I interviewed him. I may not ever be able to go back, but I interviewed him, and he charges protection money, and the Allies, including the Australians, pay him protection money to look after them on the road from Tarankot to Kandahar. Now, there's plenty of people, and he's got a very questionable background. I mean, contemporarily, he's been associated, many people say, in all sorts of dubious things. Now, you ask the military chiefs in Uruzgan, why are we associating with him? And they say, well, he's powerful. And I think they've taken a decision that you've got to work within the power structures that exist, because if you try to dismantle an entire country's history and power structures, you're fighting a losing battle from the beginning. So they've opted to do that, but that means that they're shacking up with a bloke with all kinds of questionable allegiances. And the other problem that you find in Afghanistan is that it's not white hats and black hats. People change hats. So, the person who is your ally one day is not necessarily your ally the next day, and that becomes an enormous problem. So I don't have an answer for the withdrawal, but I do think the people who are smarter than me, who manage these things, should be thinking very carefully about it, and I'm sure that they are. And I do also think that we need to be mindful, coming back to the point about it being politicians who make these decisions, that even though we're being told it's going to be a conditions-based withdrawal, we also have a timetable, and those two things seem to me to be a little contradictory. And ultimately I think the timetable will probably win, because the US president is facing an election within the next couple of years. He will be running for a second term. He will be wanting to be seen to be having these things cleaned up, and I think there will be pressure to move. And I know from talking to soldiers on the ground that they believe that they're getting things done, but they've got work that they believe they still have to do, and so that at some point there'll come a crunch about managing that, to make sure that they don't end up being very much at the sharp end or the rough end of that transition. I don't know, there may be other people who have views about withdrawal. I just think we have to be careful about it, and I think when you say get out tomorrow, you need to be realistic about the potential impact of that on the people that are there, both Afghans and others.
Bill. Thank you, Karen. You mentioned about crime, criminals, and I'm wondering to take that a bit further. Earlier this month, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime issued its report on its opium survey of Afghanistan, and in Uruzgan province it increased 45% between 2010 and 2011. Now, as you've probably done for your book, you read through Alfred McCoy's documentation of the extent to which the CIA tolerated and even encouraged the drug trade in Afghanistan as a means of financing the insurgency against the Soviet Union, and it prevailed. They left in 1989. The drug trade, I just put it to you and seek your reaction, the drug trade still finances insurgency, but against us.
Yeah.
And it's the markets for this drug trade are Europe, United States, Australia. In that sense, we are financing the enemy, are we not?
Yeah, and I think the drug problem is a huge problem in Afghanistan, and I don't know that anyone's had a solution to it. There have been a number of strategies that have been tried, from crop substitution to eradication, and it flourishes. When I was there in 2007, we went to a village. On the one day we actually went outside the wire, and there was a magnificent opium crop growing there. And it's because it raises a lot of money, and so the farmers, they can plant corn or they can plant opium, and you'll make much more money from opium. So it's an economic development issue as well as an issue of consequence to those countries where the end product ends up. Yes, I think you're right. I mean, there's an awful lot written about the history of conflicts going back through the Soviets and invasions of Afghanistan over the centuries. The Taliban, certainly when it was in government, one of the things they did do was stamp out, or virtually stamp down on the drug trade, because at that point the Taliban
stamped down cultivation, not trade.
Well, certainly they actively discouraged the drug trade, and they had some success. According to statistics, they had some success, but they were a far more pure ideologically organisation than they are now, and now they don't do that. They facilitate it because it funds the activities that they're engaged in alongside other networks of insurgents. So I think it's a huge problem. I don't think it's not my understanding that we have any solution to that at this point. And you're right, countries like Australia, like the US, like Europe, and Asia, let's not forget, and also Afghanistan are suffering through the use of those drugs and the distribution and the crime networks that they fund. So I don't know, I've been speaking to people as recently as today about the problem with drugs, and I think it's a huge, intractable problem, and I don't know what the solution is.
We've got time for 2 more questions. Did you still have a question, Jeff? Yeah.
Excuse me. Robert Fisk, I heard on the radio a few weeks ago say that the British were fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan in 1892, and he said that historians now regard them as freedom fighters at that time. The first question, please, is what's changed? The second bit is, thinking back to the Vietnam War, there seem to be at least a few parallels with Australia's involvement in this one. Propping up corrupt governments and all that sort of stuff. I can think of a couple of 2 or 3 reasons why Australia hasn't erupted to get Australian troops out, as we did during the Vietnam War. Government and opposition both think it's a good idea this time. Not many people getting killed. What else?
Yeah.
Could you comment on the first and answer the second, please?
I read a lot in the course of this research, and there are a couple of books in particular I can recommend. There's one called Afghanistan, which I think is by Roderick Braithwaite, I think is his name, and another one called In Afghanistan by David Loyne, who's a BBC journalist. And they go back over Afghan history in a very readable way, and the Afghanistan one is about the Russian period, and it's quite interesting to read the ambitions of the Russians when they went in, and the way they parallel with some of the things that are described now. And if you read those books, you get a pretty clear impression that these people have seen it all before, and they've been through this before. And in fact, when I spoke to some of those SAS guys, they said it was interesting that when they went in there, they found a lot of the debris of other conflicts still lying around, old smashed up tanks and things. And whereas in our country, we tidy all that up and put it away, maybe in a museum or somewhere else, but these people left it all there. And it was interesting hearing the soldiers talking about their response to that, and they felt like there was a bit of a message there for those who've come after, just from the local people saying, you people, we have seen you all before and we are still here. You know, you left all your crap behind last time. We don't care where you come from, we'll see you off. And I do think there's a bit of a sense of that with Afghanistan. They're really tough people. They're very tough, hardy people, and they have seen those conflicts before. And yes, there are parallels, and yes, there are parallels you can draw with Vietnam. I'm not sure that it's a perfect, I mean, there'll be scholars of Vietnam who know a lot more about it than me, but I'm not sure that it's a perfect analogy because the country was sort of divided in two, and it's a slightly different situation when you're dealing with a shadowy network of insurgents that move across national borders as well. But yeah, there are certainly some similarities between those two conflicts. What was the second part of your question? Apologies.
Why hasn't Australia erupted?
Well, I guess it goes back to that early stuff. I don't know the answer, and I think we tend not to discuss and debate things when there is bipartisan support for them. At the political level, it tends to go quiet because the major parties agree, and we don't find conflict. Maybe that's our fault in the media. Maybe it's the public's fault for not injecting themselves. Maybe we should organise rallies if we're opposed to things and get out there and make our voices heard. But I think people were shocked by September 11. They were shocked, and I think that things happened so quickly after the shock that maybe nobody stopped and sort of went, should we be doing this? Interestingly, I wrote a column. I worked for the West Australian newspaper at the time when we were in Washington, and they were a pretty amazing few days to be there. And I wrote a newspaper column that appeared. The events there happened on a Tuesday morning, and I wrote this column for Friday, and I said, what are we committing ourselves to here? What is this? We haven't had a parliamentary debate, we haven't had any discussion, the Prime Minister has decided, what are we doing? And I got hate mail when I got home, not masses of it, but I don't usually I get some hate mail, but this was pretty putrid, calling me a traitor because I dared to say, what are we doing? There wasn't that debate. It wasn't. I don't know why. People didn't feel the need to have it. I don't know. But I don't think we had it. And I do think, I don't know whether it's a parliamentary mechanism we need. There are people who say that's not perfect either, because that can come back on the forces who are being deployed, and I understand that argument. But there isn't a mechanism to facilitate that kind of a debate. We've subsequently had a debate in Parliament, but it was a whole lot of people getting up, reading onto the record, a lot of stuff we already knew, and it was 10 years after it started. So I'm not sure that's really the debate I'm talking about. It's better than not having anything, but it wasn't really what I was talking about.
Time for one more question at the back. Yeah.
Hi, Karen. You mentioned the 4 types of insurgents in Uruzgan, and it seems to paint a picture of what we here refer to as the Taliban, as a series of disparate tribal and religious groups that don't share much other than probably a hatred of Americans. And I was just wondering to what extent you can actually refer coherently to the Taliban as a united entity.
Well, going back to the 4 groups, I should say I think I probably attributed that, I may have falsely attributed that to the American colonel. We talked about these different groups. I put them in 4 categories in my mind, but it's 2 kind of categories of insurgent, and then 2 that aren't insurgent, that have just got criminal behaviour or tribal rivalries on their minds, and they all just happen to use the same methods. Part of the problem is that now, because this has gone on for so long, you've got a whole lot of networks of people with all kinds of agendas, but united by their desire to get rid of foreign forces for whatever reason. And you can understand, if we had foreign forces in our country for 10 years, I reckon we'd be wanting them out too. And so, they can gather up some sympathy from people who haven't been engaged in the conflict in the past. And now, there's a murky network of a whole lot of organisations working together. So it isn't just the Taliban. The Taliban used to have a sort of pure ideological position, like I mentioned about drugs, and they didn't believe in graven images. Remember, they blew up the Bamiyan Buddhas, and that was all about a pure ideology. Well, now they use the internet, and they associate with Al Qaeda, the Haqqani network, Hekmatyar, another figure involved in insurgency. There's a whole long list of organisations and individuals with various agendas that are all sort of banding together and are being described as the insurgency, and that's one of the problems, that you're not dealing with one group with one agenda. And they cross borders as well. They cross northern borders, and they cross the border into Pakistan, and the traditional tribal lands go right across those borders. And it's particularly in the south, but not entirely in the south, that it's a problem. And it's a very complicated country. It's a really complicated